Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this guest lecture on private military security companies and international relations. As a quick introduction, my name is Ethan Pate. I am one of the event coordinators for the Security Distillery. It's a student-led think tank in connection with the University of Glasgow's IMSIS program. Today, I have the unique opportunity to introduce Dr. Sean McFate as today's guest lecturer. Dr. McFate is a foreign policy expert, author, and novelist. He is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a professor of strategy at the National Defense University and Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. Additionally, he serves as an advisor to Oxford University's Center for Technology and Global Affairs. He is a celebrated author, receiving the title of book for his book, Goliath, Why the West Doesn't Win Wars and What We Need to Do About It, received a Book of the Year nomination by The Economist, as well as receiving high praise for his book, The Modern Mercenary, Private Armies and What They Mean for World Order. Regarding the structure of this talk, there will be a Q&A portion at the end of the lecture. So please put any questions you have in the chat and we'll do our best to work through them during that portion of the presentation. Additionally, for the sustainability, this session will be recorded and will be posted to the Security Distillery's website, along with a summary document for this event. With all that out of the way, Dr. McFate, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for your time today. Today we're going to talk about mercenaries and private military companies. And just for some way of background is that I am not just an academic and scholar who studies this, but I was actually a practitioner. I started off my career as a paratrooper in the U.S. Army's 82nd Airborne Division, and then I hopped the fence, if you will, went to the dark side and became a private military contractor in Africa. Many would say mercenary. And I did that for many years, operating around the world, until at some point I realized that there were no old people in my business. And it caused me to think deeply about what are the implications for the increased privatization of force in world affairs that seems to be largely ignored. So I ended up, long story short, getting a PhD, London School of Economics. I am now a professor at Georgetown and the National Defense University. So today what I'm going to discuss with you is the implications of the increased private military for force in the world and what that means for the world going forward. So first of all, can you see my slides? So I know I'm not insane. Get a slide check to make sure you can all see this.
I can see it.
Okay, great, thank you. So we're seeing mercenaries used around the world increasingly. Private force is a growing trend and one of the most important yet underreported trends in modern sort of security governance. We're seeing mercenaries in Libya. In fact, Libya in some ways is a mercenary fight. It reminds me a little bit of European Middle Ages. We don't really know who's on the ground in Libya. All the warriors are masked and they fight in the shadows. We're seeing former US Navy SEALs and Green Berets acting as death squads in Yemen for Middle East monarchies, according at least to media reporting. We're seeing private maritime security in places like the Gulf of Aden or Straits of Malacca or Gulf of Guinea. In fact, freighters and others, increasingly use these sort of private, they're not really privateers, but, on embarked security is what they're called. In Nigeria, Nigeria, which has a strong military for 6 years, was having trouble dealing with Boko Haram. And in 2015, they secretly hired mercenaries to go after them. And the mercenaries showed up with Mi-24 attack line helicopters and special operations forces. And they worked with the Nigerian military to push Boko Haram outside of northern Nigeria, right? Something that the Nigerian military alone could not do in 6 years, they did in a matter of weeks. We're seeing former, US, UK, other soldiers who leave the military, who are Iraq vets, show up in Kurdistan, for example, in Erbil, ISIS, when ISIS was prominent there. And we're seeing cyber mercenaries, hackback companies. And what these are hackers that you can hire. If you're like a CEO of a company, you get hacked, you hire these hackers to go after the hackers who hacked you. And it's not that they're going to get back your stolen data. That's all gone. The idea behind this is it's deterrence. So if you're a Russian or Chinese or a international criminal organization who hacks people, and they know that company A has a hackback company and the company B does not, they'll go for company B. It's a softer target. At least that's the theory of deterrence with hackback. Whether that's true or not, that sounds like a master's thesis. So we're seeing private force grow around the world. And we can go into why that is, but we'll save that for Q&A. I don't want to look at the past or even I don't look at the past right now. We can certainly do that in Q&A. I want to think about today, and I want to use as a case study the Wagner Group. I think many of you have heard of, this is a Russian mercenary company called the Wagner Group. Now, it doesn't typify the entire industry, which is quite diverse, right? But it's a growing part of the industry, and I think others are looking at it as a potential model. So let's do a deep dive about the Wagner Group, and then come out the other end about, what do we learn about, the privatization of force for international relations, the future of armed conflict, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So this is going to be a simple brief. I'm going to talk to you about the what, who, when, where, and why of the Wagner Group. And at the end, we'll do the implications, not just of Wagner Group, but this growing trend in international security or insecurity. So let's start with this. How many Russian mercenary groups do you think exist? You don't have to answer, you can answer in your chat if you wish, but just take a guess, quietly to yourself. How many Russian mercenary groups are out there? The answer is, we don't know. We don't know how many are out there. Wagner Group is one of a few. There's at least a few. Some of these may be defunct. Some of them morphed into something else. Some of them active. The most infamous one is the Wagner Group. And the one that's currently, it seems to be used the most, at least from the outside world's perspective, is the Wagner Group, which is why I'm going to focus on them. So here's a question. What is the Wagner Group? Are they a GRU militia? And the GRU is Russia's military intelligence wing. Are they just like the little green men who work for the GRU, but they're called the Wagner Group? Are they a private military company, a PMC, whatever that means? Are they a mercenary outfit? We don't know what they are. Or some of you are like, well, let's kill them all, let God sort them out. What do you think? Again, don't have to chime up audio, but if you want to put in the chat, you can. Well, it's actually a complex question. We can take off Zdano and kill them all, immediately. But maybe they're one of these three. Maybe they're a GRU militia. Maybe they're a PMC. Maybe they're a mercenary outfit. There are experts out there who are in one of these three camps, right? Some believe that the Wagner Group is just like little green men. Some believe they're a PMC. Some believe they're mercenaries. I have an opinion, but you'll get to that in the end. So I say they are not a militia. They are not a GRU. They are not the little green men. They are not the little green men are a standing Russian military unit deployed overseas without their insignia, hence the moniker little green men. These are not, the Wagner Group personnel are not members of a statutory armed forces of Russia. They are contractors, right? They are outside the statutory system. So they're not militia. They are not militia. They are also not astroturfed Russian separatist militia, as we saw in Ukraine, right? Where we saw all these Russian separatists in Eastern Ukraine in 2014, 2015, who it really turns out were kind of astroturfed militia fostered by the GRU, right? In fact, Wagner Group was sent to discipline them. So some of these separatist leaders were saying during the fight, they got weak knees. Like, we really don't want to go to war against our Ukrainian brothers that much. And Wagner was sent in to basically threaten to kill the commanders, saying, no, you're going to fight the fight. All right. And rumor is that they also went to Venezuela in 2018 to keep the Venezuelan military from defecting from Maduro to Guaido. That's the rumor. They're also not a proxy militia the way that Hezbollah is for Iran or the Peshmerga is. They're not an idealistic organization that fights for a cause or for a homeland. They are not Hezbollah, right? So they're not a proxy militia either. So if they're not a militia, what are they? Well, they're used by the GRU, but they are not owned by the GRU. Sometimes Russia has also used Russian mafia overseas abroad, but it doesn't own those Russian mobs, it uses them. I think this is a better analogy for the Wagner Group than any sort of militia model. They use them in a way sort of like organized crime. But Wagner Group is not organized crime. So what are they? Are they a private military company or are they a mercenary? Now, in case you don't know, there has been volumes of ink spilled on the distinction between private military companies and mercenaries. Academics have spent 15 years trying to unravel this Gordian knot, including myself. Here's where I come down. The distinction is irrelevant. And I say this as somebody who came from the industry. If you can do one, you can do the other, right? If you can do the things that a mercenary would do, you can do the things a private military contractor can do, or vice versa. It depends on market conditions and the will of the individual contractor / mercenary. The distinction is mostly a euphemism, right? So here's an example. Blackwater versus Wagner Group. Now, Blackwater, the United States of America used Blackwater heavily, used Blackwater in the war in Iraq, and it called them a private military company. And the United States calls the Wagner Group a mercenary organization. But in truth, they kind of do the same thing, right? And Russia used to call Blackwater mercenaries, and Russia calls the Wagner Group a private military company. The label is mostly just one of political expediency. It's political, there's no rigorous differentiation. Where you stand really depends on where you sit on this label, right? Let's look at the type of stuff they do. Are they mercenaries? Again, America called Blackwater private military companies. Most of the world views Blackwater as mercenary. And Russia calls Wagner Group private military company. Most of the world views Wagner Group as mercenary. Does the client have domestic anti-mercenary laws on the books? Yes, both do. Hence, they have to call them contractors and not mercenary because that would be illegal. Are these groups, Blackwater, Wagner, do they have veterans of the client's armed forces? Yes, Blackwater was founded by ex-Navy SEALs. Yes, Wagner Group was founded by ex-Russian Spetsnaz special forces. It doesn't mean because at their vets, they work for the statutory armed forces of the United States of America or the Russian armed forces. That's an assumption that many, I think, lazy observers make. And are they a member of the client's statutory armed forces? No, for both of them. Neither of them are a member of the client's statutory armed forces. They are private sector. Now, they may work mostly for the client, like Blackwater is working mostly for the United States government. Wagner Group is working mostly for the Russian government, but that could change if a better client comes around. We can't assume they will forever work for one client. That would be silly. So after the contract, where might they go? So here's the problem. Like people who thought, Blackwater was just a militia of the US military. No, when the contract ends, they go someplace else. Some go home, but some find new jobs. And we see you see Blackwater vets, if you will, in wars abroad, in Yemen, and look at, the founder himself, where's Eric Prince worked? And we don't know where former Wagner Group contractors end up. So you have to think about these groups not just as a solid company, as a organization. You have to think about the personnel, and they can change. So think about maybe like Sainsbury or something. You can't think of a grocery store chain and companies. They hire different clerks, like a meat packing clerk, a cashier. That cashier can go to a rival grocery market chain if they want to. That's how private sector works. That's how markets work. It's not how the public sector works, but it's how the private sector works. And that's how the private sector warriors work. All right, they change companies, they change clientele. That's what makes them different than, say, the US Army or the UK Army or the Russian Army. So really, the label PMC is a euphemism. The term mercenary is more accurate, and it has a lot of stigma attached that kind of derives from a post-Peace of Westphalia, post-30 Years War era, which we can discuss in Q&A if you wish, the origins of the stigma against mercenary, but it wasn't always so, okay? It wasn't always so. So who is a mercenary? The simplest definition is this: they are armed civilians operating as paramilitaries in foreign wars, mostly for profit, okay? It's the second oldest profession. The Bible talks about, sell swords. Romans fought wars a lot with mercenaries, and in medieval times, mercenaries were how you fought wars in Europe. Mercenaries were considered an honorable but bloody trade for the most part. It's only the stigma today against mercenaries is a recent and modern invention, construction, and it's quickly unraveling. We're going back to the status quo ante, where mercenaries were kind of a common thing in international relations. Some view them as a nuisance, some view them as a necessity. So here are the common missions of most mercenaries today. Again, I'm using PMC and mercenary kind of interchangeably. First is direct action. This is basically combat arms. This is like, for example, the UAE hired a lot of Latin American former special operators to go into Yemen to kill Houthis, right? Iranian-backed Houthis in the war in Yemen. That's called direct action. It's combat operations. They also do military training. This is professionalizing your client's professional, it's professionalizing your client's militia, for lack of a better word. Your professional, whether that's a country like the Central African Republic, or whether your terrorists hire mercenaries to do this. Nusra Front did this. They can train and equip or create sort of armed forces for you. And lastly, they do reconnaissance, strategic reconnaissance on the ground. And here we see both governments use them as well as, say, the extractive industry, the financial services industry. When you want to do exotic due diligence and you want to figure out who owns that gold mine in Katanga province in the DRC, you might have to send one of these groups in there to ground truth it. And that's what they do as well. They do a lot of that. All covert, obviously. So how does the mercenary world operate? I know some of you are thinking about what you might do after you graduate. Well, this is not job day, but I will just tell you off, sort of on the sideline. It's international. They recruit internationally, but it's the inverse about how national militaries recruit. So national militaries recruit. The UK military only recruits from, UK citizens with a few exceptions. And they put banners out there and, come to our office and enlist, et cetera, et cetera. That's not how the mercenary world can do it because it's kind of illegal. How illegal it is, we can discuss in Q&A, and how much that matters, we can also discuss in Q&A. So because it's illegal, it's more like an illicit, or these are illicit organizations, sort of like narcos in Latin America. So it's network-based. It's who you know. And the networks are around 3 command languages: English speakers, Russian speakers, and Spanish speakers. And when I say command language, this is not to be confused with patriotism, right? This is just command language is the language that the orders are given. So if you understand English, you can follow an English-speaking mercenary commander, Russian and Spanish as well. But it also is military culture. So those who grew up in, say, NATO countries and served in NATO militaries have a certain way they do military operations, which is quite different than the way Russians do military operations or other big militaries do military operations. They all have a different way, different SOPs, different, say, best practices. So the command language is not just tied to the language, it's also tied to your military background, your military culture, your military training. And this is what happens. So if I was still in the industry and I was hired to do something, say, in Libya, and I needed to make, a mercenary team, I would hit my networks of people I used to serve with, right? And say, hey, I need a radio operator with these skill sets. Do you know somebody, right? And then I hit my network, right? And the Wagner Group, they're in the Russian network, right? These are all ex-Soviet, era, or not Soviet era, Soviet satellite republics, or Russian, and that's who they get. They get people who have served in the Russian military, the Ukrainian military, the Serbian military, and that's who kind of works in, we think, in the Wagner Group. But they're not just Russian. They're not little green men. They come from around that ecosystem, that military ecosystem. There are other command languages too that are small, like French, Hebrew, and others, Polish. So these are not militia. These are not ideological groups. These are driven mostly by profit, not exclusively. They are profit maximizing entities. So, you should not think about them like cheap Army reservists as the way, that's how the US military used to think about Blackwater. Like, well, when we're done in Iraq and Afghanistan, we've won in Iraq and Afghanistan so easily, we used to think, they'll just go home and reintegrate into the civilian workforce like they're cheap US Army reservists. But they are not. They are profit maximizing entities. They will find new clients. All right. Now they have weak loyalty, strong profit motive, and it's difficult to enforce contracts. And that's always been the problem for contract warfare. And this leads to treachery, as Niccolo Machiavelli famously discusses in his book, The Prince. And in this book, he lashes out against mercenaries as faithless. And he creates a militia in Florence in the early, 1506, 1509, who get then trounced by professional mercenaries in 1512, right? I mean, that's the problem, is you can't take, farmers with pitchforks and put them against battle-hardened mercenaries and not, and you'll get obliterated. And that's one of the reasons that the Republic of Florence fell, was because of his weak militia, right? Now, and also they're not always disloyal. I mean, Sir John Hawkwood, who was an English mercenary, one of the most famous mercenary captains of the 15th century, he served Florence monogamously for 23 years until he died. In fact, if you go into the Duomo of Florence, you will see his visage there. And, the thing about Machiavelli, we always think he's the authority on mercenaries, but he's not. Hawkwood would say to Machiavelli, I think, you just are terrible at managing your mercenaries. Don't blame mercenaries on your mismanagement and ineptitude. And that's how most people viewed, people like Machiavelli in his century. It was like, Florence was a rich, inept city-state when it came to its own defense, right? We can talk, again, about all these things more in Q&A. So loyalty, though, for mercenary is for rent. And this causes a lot of problems for all sides. It's not just, this is the problem that national militaries kind of solve, is you don't have to worry about loyalty, especially in a total war. But it's a problem for both mercenaries and their masters, because there's a lot of history of both mercenaries ripping off their masters, but masters ripping off the mercenaries. And you know who was a huge deadbeat in the Middle Ages? Was the papacy. They were one of the worst deadbeats, non-payers. They used to hire these huge mercenary armies and then sort of not pay them. But mercenaries today are not these cartoonish Hollywood villains. It's far more complicated than that. So here, for example, for Wagner Group, it's owned by this guy called Prigozhin. And he may be loyal to Putin, but doesn't mean that all the rank and file in the Wagner Group are. For them, it's a paycheck. And if Prigozhin loses favor with Putin and loses the contract, those Wagner Group rank and file might work for somebody else and may not work for a pro-Russian government at all, a pro-Russian organization at all. So you got to think about these as not just sort of private military units, but the actual personnel inside of them. So here's a test for you. Who does Eric Prince work for now? He was the founder of Blackwater. His sister is Nancy DeVos, who's a cabinet secretary for President Trump. When he had Blackwater, he used to wrap himself in the American flag and say nobody was more patriotic than him for America. Does anybody know who he works for now? He works for China. Many in Washington would say China is America's main geo competitor. And he's doing Belt Road Initiative in Africa, which Belt Road Initiative is also a security policy, not just an economic one, of Beijing, right? So he's an example of the loyalty problem. And when he was pitching this idea that the US should privatize the war in Afghanistan, replacing all NATO troops with a handful of his mercenaries to quote, fix Afghanistan in 6 months, which is what he was pitching, or a year, he was still working for China. He runs he has a company called Frontier Services Group. It's headquartered in Hong Kong. Frontier Services Group, the main investor is the Chinese government. You do the math. So who controls the Wagner Group? Eric Prince, Dmitry Yukin, who is one of the founders of it, Prigozhin, GRU, FSB. Who do you think controls the Wagner Group? It is, we think, Prigozhin. Again, I have to say we think because you're not going to get Prigozhin on record saying this, right? But information points to that as the most likely conclusion. So who is this guy? He is sometimes named Putin chef by the Western media. He was born in Leningrad in the early 60s. He spent much of his youth in jail, in organized crime. And then when he got out in the 1990s, he started off with like a hot dog stand in front of the mayor's office in St. Petersburg. And we don't know, but at that point, Putin was working in the mayor's office in St. Petersburg. The two seems to, at some point, have met and formed a bond. And Prigozhin built this huge catering business, which serves the Kremlin today. And he also founded the Wagner Group and the internet research agency known as the Troll Factory. He is now on the U.S. sanctions list. And in 2018, U.S. criminal charges came against him. So here's a network of his stuff, right? He works, he's in what you think is the inner circle of Putin, or he used to be, or he still is. He has an umbrella company called Concord. And in this, he has the Troll Factory, Wagner Group, and Avropolis, which is like a natural gas oil company. These are all under sanctions from the US Treasury. Yukin now works for him. Yukin was the head or the founder of the Wagner Group, and he's a former colonel in Russian special forces. Wagner Group works with Avropolis. So, for example, when Syria was, fighting ISIS, what Syria said to Russia is like, look, we have a deal for you. If you can send some mercenaries to kill ISIS in these natural gas fields, we'll give you license to drill there. And so Putin turned to Prigozhin and says, it's yours if you want it. And Wagner Group was sent in there to clear out ISIS so that Prigozhin's oil and gas company could drill there, right? And that is a classic way that you pay mercenaries, right? Is that you give them a stake in natural resources. That way, the mercenaries and the clients sort of go into business for each other. You don't have to worry about being ripped off by either. Wagner secures the oil drill area or the natural gas drill area, and then the oil company sucks the oil out of the ground and brings it to market to turn a profit. So it's a symbiotic relationship. And during the entire time, you have the troll factory covering for Wagner Group, the moves of Russia, etc. And the three of these can reinforce each other under the umbrella company of Concord, under the management of Prigozhin, who has an in with Putin, right? So that's in some ways how the modern mercenary works. It's very sophisticated, and the Wagner Group is also very lethal. They gave U.S. in 2018 they went against some of America's best troops and best aviation and gave them a big fight. We can talk about that in Q&A. These are not cartoonish Hollywood villains, and they are not like the lone dude with a Kalashnikov in the Congolese jungle in 1962. These are sophisticated, lethal organizations that work in parallel with others in the global financial world industry. Again, these groups are all under US Treasury sanctions list, right? It doesn't stop them, does it? So where has the Wagner Group operated? Take a guess here. Take a guess. We think 15 foreign countries, okay? So here are the places Wagner Group has operated. And some of the places you can see that there's an extractive industry connection there through Prigozhin's own groups like Evropolis. They're in Libya. We think they're in Venezuela. There are media reports of them in Venezuela in 2018 and 19, but again, there's no hard evidence on the ground. It's not like going to get them. No, Wagner Group has run into trouble. As you can see, Russia is expanding expeditionarily into Africa for the first time since the Cold War ended. And they're doing it mostly through the Wagner Group. Mostly through the Wagner. It's their new weapon of choice, and we'll talk about why. But they're having struggles. What the Wagner Group is learning is that, operating in Ukraine, operating in the Middle East, that's cupcakes compared to warfare in Africa. If you want to get a PhD in war, you go to Africa, right? Sad to say. And they're getting their butts kicked in Mozambique, which is off the coast from Madagascar, and in Libya as well. They're having setbacks, so their badass stock is falling. So when did Wagner Group start? Take a guess. How old is Wagner Group? It is, about 7 years old, we think. Again, none of this is going to be stuff you're going to find in some archive someplace, but we think we started hearing chatter about it in 2013. So why does it exist? All of the above. It gives Moscow plausible deniability, and we'll talk about that. It gives Russia, casualty avoidance. Russia, like the UK and the United States of America, the population of Russia hates seeing dead Russian soldiers come home in body bags, but they don't care about contractors. So this way it allows the Kremlin some freedom of maneuver, some moral hazard in policymaking to do expeditionary warfare without the population disliking it. Mercenaries are also cheaper. And in some ways, the US and the UK normalized using PMCs in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. How can the US and UK finger wag at Moscow saying, don't use these private military actors, that's against international norms, when the US and UK have relied on them so heavily in the last 15 years? We can't. So this is why the Wagner Group exists. So why is private force resurrecting? Now, we're going to leave Wagner Group alone here. It's resurrecting around the world, and here's why. There's a couple of reasons. We're seeing strong countries use them, like Russia, the UK, the United States, countries which already have very strong militaries. Why do they need to use outsourced firepower? Well, there's two reasons. Is that The first and most important is they provide some modicum of plausible deniability. We live, warfare is getting sneakier. That's what modern war is doing. We live in an information age, and in an information age, weapons that give you plausible deniability are more important than firepower, right? So I call this shadow warfare. Look at how Russia took Ukraine. In the old rules of war, they would have blitzkrieged into Ukraine, as they did in Czechoslovakia or Hungary in the Cold War, and put their boot on the neck of the Ukrainians. Now, firepower is a liability. It's not an asset. So they create a ghost occupation using shadowy forces like Spetsnaz and Wagner Group and Little Green Men and these AstroTurf fake separatist units and lots of active measures and dense propaganda. They create the fog of war so that when Western policymakers are trying to figure out what the heck was going on in Ukraine, the Crimea was already a fait accompli. And only then did you see conventional war weapons like tanks and destroyers show up. So Wagner's mercenaries are amongst the best plausible deniability weapons because they can do what they call zero footprint operations. This means, like, just say you use special forces someplace. If those special forces get caught and put on YouTube, then, Moscow, London, DC has to deal with that, has to send in a rescue party, has to do, damage control. If they're just contractors, they can just cut them like a kite, and they're called kite operations. And so this is very useful if you want to sort of fight in the gray areas of modern international relations. Also, if you have a society that doesn't want to bleed for war, contractors are a good option. You can take chances in war, but not have to have political blowback for your soldiers coming back home in body bags, because the truth is, Russians, UK, Americans do not care about dead contractors, even if they are Russian citizens, British citizens, or American citizens. They look at mercenaries like you had it coming and we don't care about you. This allows policymakers to take more risk in entering war. It lowers the barriers of entry to conflict, which is why Russia is all over Africa and the Middle East with contractors and not the Russian army. Now, if you're a wealthy country but don't have a strong military, obviously, like you're like the UAE, obviously mercenaries are useful because it allows you to participate in armed conflict without having to make your own military. And we're seeing also oligarchs get into this, and extractive industry, who's hiring these same group of people more and more, whether they're doing, some of them are more defensive operations, some are not. We can talk about that. And it also allows you to rent expensive niche services. So when Nigeria hired mercenaries, those guys showed up in attack helicopters and special operations groups that were equal, if not better, than Nigeria's military, right? So it allows you to rent expensive niche services. And for everybody, private force is useful because it's cheaper. Renting is cheaper than owning for the most part. It's apolitical. So, this idea that they only work for themselves, sometimes they want to align themselves with a sugar daddy like DC or Moscow, and they could be more loyal. They could be more loyal to the paycheck than ideology. And we saw this in the middle of the 12th century when Henry II had a big civil war in his hands. Half his aristocracy was trying to kill him. He didn't turn to the other half of the aristocracy to raise an army. He used continental mercenaries who were just loyal to his paycheck to wage war and beat down the aristocrats, which is what he did. This is contrary to Machiavelli. Supply and demand are increasing, and they're diversifying every year, and this creates more and more market opportunity, and international law cannot stop this trend. I mean, who's going to go into Libya and arrest all those mercenaries? The UN's not going to do it. The EU's not going to do it. NATO's not going to do it. And also, your mercenaries can shoot your law enforcement dead cold, right? So mercenaries resist arrest. They can kill your law enforcement, which makes them hard to regulate because there's no monopoly of force when it comes to regulating this market, the market for force. Okay, so if you privatize war, does it change warfare? It's the last question. When you privatize things, what happens? It changes strategy a lot. It changes it fundamentally in ways that our 4-stars do not grasp, because they grew up in a Westphalian era with Westphalian militaries reading nothing but Clausewitz, who's a Westphalian strategic thinker, right? So when you privatize war, warfare starts to look like this. Strategy starts to looks like Clausewitz meets Adam Smith. Clausewitz is a famous Prussian military theorist from the Napoleon era. His book on war is seminal and read by all Western militaries. But, you know, he talks about, he's like conventional war. But Adam Smith, Scottish, Adam Smith is, you know, it's like the strategies of the souk or marketplace enter warfare. And again, in ways that 4-stars do not comprehend, because it's a different type of war. So here's some strategies, right? And I'm not going to go into detail here. We'll go to Q&A very shortly. I outline these more thoroughly in my book, The New Rules of War, which in the UK is titled Goliath. They're essentially the same book, but you can do all sorts of sneaky things. So clients can rip off mercenaries and do weird and sneaky things that contort war and war strategy and international relations as we know them. Also, mercenaries can do all sorts of weird things that Machiavelli learned about firsthand. Primarily, they can start and elongate wars for profit. When they're in between contracts, they become banditos, and they can engage in banditry and racketeering. And essentially, a world awash in mercenaries is a world with more human suffering. And both is that when you privatize warfare, when you make conflict a commodity, contract enforcement is really, really hard. And this leads to treachery on all sides. And this is what we need more thinking about, is how do we get around this? IOs don't think about this at all. And big nation states, Westphalian ones, do not at all. So here's the problem, is that the proliferation of mercenaries is leading to lateral escalation. This is creating a security dilemma that's all under the radar because, you know, again, shadow wars, plausible deniability, and this creates more contracts. So we're in a cycle that's generating more private warfare in international relations. I write more about this in my 2 books. These are essentially the same book, The New Rules of War in the US, Goliath in the UK. And at this point, let's turn it, Ethan, over to questions.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Oh, excellent. Thank you so much so far. You touched on this earlier and was a bit curious about it. The legality of public recruitment. If you could.
Yeah. So, well, it depends. So if you're United States of America and you want to use this, you call them private military companies. If you are Russia, you call them private military companies. The laws around this are really difficult because both Russia and the US and the UK have anti-mercenary laws, but we also have other problems too. Like we have people who go and volunteer for, say, the Israeli Defense Forces, who may not be Israeli citizens. Are they mercenaries? Are they not? I don't know. Also, enforcing these laws can be tricky. South Africa had the most powerful domestic anti-mercenary laws on their books in the 2000s. But if you look at many of the mercenaries in Nigeria in 2015, a good deal of them came from South Africa, we are told from inside information. So it's really, you know, law alone for different reasons cannot control or regulate this growing industry, which is why it's been growing for the last 15 years.
And I believe Yusuf G has a question for you if Yusuf is still here and would like to unmute themselves in order to ask it. They seem to have left the chat. Given how Syrian fighters are already allegedly involved in the ongoing Nagorno and Karabakh conflict, do you see the possibility of the Wagner Group becoming party to the conflict on behalf of Armenia? More so since Armenia is using Russian defense technology already.
So I think the answer is quite possibly. I don't know for sure. But we have to think about these military ecosystems that they all work around in, right? So I think where you see Wagner Group and Russian, you should expect there to be some linkages, but also don't think of them as red lines. So we also have some former black, Eric Prince-like guys also working in Libya for the same masters as Wagner Group. There's an Australian former Air Force officer who was there doing a sort of I'm not sure what he was doing arms imports, creating a militia or whatever. It ended badly. He fled to Malta. It disappeared. But so you can't think of these. You can't think about these in terms of like Westphalian nation-state boundaries. So IR is a lot more flexible, shall we say? But I would look to see if there's any linkages there. I'd watch that space.
We have another question asking, do you think the Wagner Group has created a new model for mercanism?
It has. I think there's a couple of things going on. I mean, looking at the success of Wagner Group, there's got to be other countries who want that success, but don't want to deal head on with, say, the West or whomever. And it's working for them. So I think other clients, whether they be state or non-state, are gauging this carefully and seeing what they can do. I think also as Wagner gets bigger, or other Wagners exist, they might split up, they might splinter, and there might be people who start their own company as well. So again, it's private sector meets public sector military. So you have to think with a private sector mentality. But I would expect to see, I would expect that we should be prepared for the possibility that others will imitate the Russian model.
So kind of, you were building to this before, and out of curiosity for it, and it might be covered in your book, but so you mentioned how there's a security dilemma being formed from these mercenary groups just continuing to perpetuate themselves. The question I have for you is, what does like the end of that cycle look like?
Well, what's the end of any security dilemma cycle look like? So look at Libya, for example. We don't know exactly who's on the ground. That's by design. Mercenaries are part of that. They create the fog of war. And they exploit the fog of war. So if you have, and we saw examples of this in, say, the Italian wars of the early Renaissance, late Middle Ages. If one side invests heavily in mercenaries, and the other side is going to invest heavily in mercenaries to create a defense, and this creates uncertainty. So both sides sort of ladder up on mercenaries. And then what happens if mercenaries trigger a war deliberately, right? So controlling private warfare is very, very difficult. I mean, controlling warfare anyway is very difficult. And before we lament the decline of Westphalian warfare, let's not forget World War I and World War II were some of the most devastating wars in human history, were led by Westphalian states with professional armies, et cetera, et cetera. But now we're seeing war become more devolved, and the control of it also becoming more devolved. And this leads to security dilemmas that can trip and trigger warfare.
I believe, Makam, you have a question for...
Yes, thank you. Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Yeah, so actually I have two questions. The first one is that can we say that the private military companies, can we call them terrorist groups? Because like this is what they are doing, like for some people it is a kind of terrorism. And can we say that the terrorist group like Taliban, they are private military companies because they are hired by someone is paying them, and there is someone behind the door. And like in the case of Russia, they were paying to Taliban to kill US troops in Afghanistan. So, and my second question is that right now China is working on building private military companies, and they are strongly working on this one. So do you think that it's for the purpose to compete with the United States or with other countries?
Well, the first question, I don't think of the Taliban or Al-Qaeda or the IRA as private military companies, because, I mean, there's Venn diagrams, right, that overlap. But, you know, terrorist groups are, at least in theory, driven by ideology. They turn often to illicit markets to fundraise So the IRA was also in bed with, illegal arms and stuff and other things like that. There's a connection between organized crime and terrorist groups. But I think the main difference is that private military companies are motivated primarily as market force actors, as market actors, whereas terrorist groups are not market actors. They do market acting separately. So I would, and it helps us to analyze what a group will do. If we know it's primarily ideological versus primarily material, as a good analyst, that can help us forecast what their next moves might be. So I think it's important to retain that distinction. China is interesting. So China has the biggest domestic security market in the world. And what I mean by that, I mean people who guard your house, or like Whack and Hut, mall guards. That's not the same as mercenaries, right? They're not paramilitary. People have thought about this, and they're watching that space. I would question this. China is is rising around the world as a force to be reckoned with, but their military is very unproven. They don't have combat vets like Russia, UK, and the United States of America. And I think that their labor, despite all their saber rattling, they're unproven, right? They may get their butts kicked someplace, and they've already had some experience of that in South Sudan. So we just don't know. I mean, the last time, look at China, right? I mean, the last time they did expeditionary warfare, it was a complete disaster. That was against, Vietnam in 79, 80, 81. They got their butts kicked back then by the Vietnamese, who have been fighting for 20 years against the French, the Americans, the Cambodians, and yes, the Chinese. So China remains to be there. They still need to be tested, if you will. And also the command language of China is very hard, right? I mean, you can have a command language of Spanish speakers, English speakers, and Russian speakers, because a lot of people speak those languages, but how many China speakers are out there? So they are limited to a labor pool that's mostly Chinese. So I don't, I think China it's TBD is my conclusion right now.
I believe Emma also has a question for you.
Yes, thank you very much. This talk has been extremely interesting so far, so thank you. I was wondering about kind of crimes against humanity and war crimes, since we know that the PMCs or mercenary groups are basically unregulated. And I'm imagining that there would be a very gendered impact of this lack of regulation in terms of sexual violence during conflict. What do we know about that so far? Can you touch on this? And a second question is that generally we tend to have kind of a moral disgust that's the reaction when we talk about these mercenary type groups. Are there any examples that we've seen where they've done something that we generally consider as like a good outcome, such as stopping a conflict or preventing a genocide or something like that? Have we seen any like more what we would consider generally positive effects? Thank you.
Okay. So your first question is, I can't speak to gender violence, but I can speak to human rights. So one of the selling points of mercenaries is because they offer some modicum of plausible deniability. If you want to wage a very, say, punitive campaign, a very, say, punitive counterinsurgency campaign, you can hire them to be heavy-handed in ways that you don't want your troops to do. I mean, your troops are capable of that, but you don't want them caught on camera, because everybody these days has an iPhone, right? And so everybody's a reporter and a publisher and everything else in one little box. So if you want to do some certain types of if you want to violate human rights for strategic objectives, you go to mercenaries. You don't have your own troops do that. So that makes them, I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why mercenaries, they're a new tool in the toolkit of statecraft, sad to say. And the reasons you'd want to use those tools are distasteful for most people, I would say, in this audience. But that's partly why they're being used. And who knows what they did with Nigeria, right? We don't know. I mean, maybe Nigeria hired them to be heavy-handed in that way. To your other point about morality is that we always, because there's this 400-year-old stigma against mercenaries, which is problematic to say. We all grew up in elementary school, or whatever, thinking that mercenaries are evil, that they're all villains. And that's not true. Again, for most of human history, mercenaries were how you fought wars. They're the second oldest profession. And we tend to think of mercenaries versus troops. We tend to think of like our soldiers as wives and mercenaries as whores. That's how we think about them, right? That they're somehow dirty and bad. The truth is that it's obviously much more nuanced than that. Mercenaries are like fire. They, if you use them well, they can power a steam engine. If you mishandle them, they can burn down the house. When I was in the industry, I was paid to help stop a potential genocide in the Rwanda region in 2004. And we did that, right? And that was a good thing. I can imagine a scenario in the future where, just say there's ISIS 2.0, and they start in Syria and Iraq, and they start to crucify Christian men and start to sell Christian women and girls on sex slave markets, as they were doing earlier. And you have an evangelical megachurch someplace else, like in Texas or Korea, and who has very little faith in the international community and the UN in particular. And I can imagine them hiring mercenaries to go into places like Syria and create islands of humanity to protect Christian militia, Christian communities, right? And mercenaries could do that. So mercenaries themselves, I think, are moral neutrals. It's more like who's hiring them and why. I think saying that they're all villainous is a pretty vapid analysis. They can be used for good or for bad. They're just a tool.
And we have another question that's been sitting there for a second there, but I can kind of combine them for us. So the first one is, can non-state actors hire PMCs? And following up to that, do we expect to see, or have we seen, multinational corporations hire PMCs for goals external to the goals of nation states?
So it's a good question. So, technically, I think the answer is no. But there's a lot of things that, also paying your taxes is something you're supposed to do. A lot of companies also have tax havens offshore, correct? So multinationals, we have to stop thinking about multinationals as the 19th century. We live in a mercantilist global system that companies always, follow the flag. In many situations, the flag follows trade, right? And we've seen this. I mean, look at in the United States today. Washington, D.C. is pretty hostile to China, but Silicon Valley is very warm to China. So there is this tension, and you see, especially in the extractive industry, them turning towards this market for force, whether you call them mercenaries or PMCs. And the reason is that they have no choice. They have to go to where their asset is, and assets like oil, gas, timber, mines, the best ones are now in the hardest to reach places. They're not, oil is no longer in Pennsylvania or in Texas. It's in, it's in difficult places. It could be in Somalia, mines in Congo, and they are tired. These multinationals are tired, frankly, being shaken down by corrupt local national governments, corrupt police forces, corrupt military forces that suck on their basically the tit of the multinational. I'm not saying multinationals don't do harm in those places, they do. But it's not just, again, all multinationals are evil, all host nations are good. It's much more nuanced. And so they are turning increasingly to this industry for defensive roles, right? But look at how they're morphing into offensive roles. So the UAE hired, when Eric Prince basically was thrown out of Blackwater, in 2010, he went to the UAE where he set up himself as a deal maker, and he helped put together with others this mercenary force for the UAE to defend oil pipelines. Well, that mercenary force in 2011-12 was used in an expeditionary sense in the Yemen war, right? So again, this idea that defense versus offense, it's all irrelevant at the end of the day. PMC versus mercenary, it's all irrelevant at the end of the day. If you have the skill set for any one of these, you can do all the other ones too. So I think we're seeing over time, non-state actors increasingly turn to the industry, including the United Nations, right? they don't use what we call mercenaries in the Wagner Group, but they now are using, armed contract guards, right? 20 years ago, that would have been anathema. Now it's routine. Could they fill out thinning peacekeeping forces with contracted, military people? Yes, they could. Should they? Maybe they should. It's a Hobson's choice to some extent. So yes, I think we're seeing the liberalization of this market across all sectors of international relations, not just nation states.
And to kind of combine another two questions. So the former executive outcomes, Chris Grove, believed that the EO could stop the Rwandan genocide with less expense. So do you think, given the experience with Boko Haram with Nigeria, do you think that is a likely occurrence? And to kind of bound onto that, can you explain more about the mercenary work, your mercenary work in Rwanda? Of course, the civil war being in 1990, and then the genocide occurred within that conflict in 1994. So are you referring to the Rwanda-Congo wars of the late 1990s, early 2000s?
So the first question is, I do think EO could have done something. I mean, EO is interesting. Executive outcomes, for those who don't know, this was sort of the mercenary corporation. They came out of the ashes of apartheid South Africa. They were the first sort of private military corporation, mercenary company. It was led by Ewan Barlow, who was a commander in their sort of special forces units. And they did some interesting, and I would argue, some good work and controversial work. They they ended the Angolan Civil War. They ended the RUF in Sierra Leone. And I think, yes, they could have helped stop or retard the Rwanda genocide of 1994. Famously or infamously, the UN reached out to EO back then and said, could you help us do this? And EO said, yes, we could. They said it would cost this much. It was a pittance compared to what a normal peacekeeping mission would cost. And ultimately, the head of UNDPKO, who was then Kofi Annan, turned it down. And he said later on that the reason he turned it down is because he said the world was not ready for privatized peacekeeping. But I would argue that the world was also not ready for 800,000 people killed in 90 days, right? That's a very expensive ideology. And it says something that Kofi Annan was elected Secretary General twice, despite this, in my opinion, reprehensible moral failing. A little bit of private military force could have gone a long way to save, a lot of people. I mean, more people died in a single day in the Rwanda genocide than all the Americans and Brits in Iraq and Afghanistan combined, right? Think about that in one day, because somebody thought it would have been ideological, distasteful to use private force to stop a genocide. So that's the problem we're up against. And yes, I do think EO could have done something. And what happens typically at EO is that they do something, and then once they succeed, the international community comes in, kind of takes some credit for their moves, and tells that host nation to fire them, to fire executive outcomes. And that's what, and then they replace it with a very expensive and ineffectual peacekeeping force, which is what happened in Sierra Leone in the 1990s. So I'm not defending EO, saying everything they did was good, but I think they're certainly more effective than most UN peacekeeping missions. In terms of my own experience, I was, in 2004, 2003, I can't talk about much of it, but because of the nature of the work, but in 2003, 2004, the US intelligence community had pretty good intel that a rebel group hiding in the Kivus in Eastern Congo wanted to reignite the genocide 10 years after it happened. And for those who don't know, the friction between the Hutu and the Tutsi ethnicities, tribes, is quite old, and it goes back to colonialism, and it goes back, at least to the 70s. And this idea of killing, a leader to ignite genocide through reprisal killings, that has been around for a very long time. And this group called the FNL in the Eastern Congo wanted to do this, and they wanted to assassinate the president of Burundi in 2004. And I was called in to stop that, and we did that. And yes, they did attack, and they did not succeed, and I'll leave it at that.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that as well. Do you predict, and then we have another one coming that's asked, do you predict an increase in PMC contracting by NGOs operating in war scenarios?
Yeah, I do. I mean, they're already doing, so NGOs are already hiring PMCs for protection, for defensive. You know, if you want to protect your people or your property in dangerous places, good luck depending on host nation forces, the United Nations. I think a lot of NGOs are coming to the conclusion slowly that there is some utility in hiring private armed guards. Not everybody, and I'm not sure to what extent it's happening. But you know, NGOs also have a moral dilemma on their hands. Just say, we'll pick a place like Libya or Somalia. Like, if they are being attacked by al-Shabaab in Somalia, they have two choices. They could either leave Somalia and leave the people that they were trying to protect and service to the mercies of al-Shabaab, which is one type of evil, or they could stick around, hire PMC to protect them, and continue their work. But hiring a PMC might be another type of evil. So that's what I'm saying, that these choices, these moral dilemmas in international relations are a lot more complex because mercenaries, they're like fire, and they could go many ways, and there's all sorts of moral nuance that wasn't quite there in the Cold War.
And the last question I have for you right now, it seems to be, do you see any scope for accountability by using existing treaties on armaments, munitions, or just embellow principle of conduct in war against the mercenaries, utilizing the same?
No, I don't. I mean, look at the United Nations. The United Nations arms embargo in Libya is the biggest punchline in Africa right now, right? I am rather pessimistic about the power of international organizations and international law. I mean, it's not just about mercenaries, but everything. Look at, from the Balkans crisis in the 1990s to the Rwanda genocide to the wars in Iraq to Syria to Libya to Ukraine. I mean, I think in some ways, Libya, Syria, and Ukraine are kind of like the Spanish Civil War was before World War II. They sort of tell us what to expect in the future. And international law, besides issuing harsh memorandums, do very little to mitigate and manage armed conflict. And if that's the UN's initial and original, I would say primary mission, is to mitigate armed conflict around the world. Of course, they only speak to states, which is a big part of the problem, since most armed conflict does not involve states. And now you have mercenaries. Again, who's going to arrest those mercenaries? Who's going to go into Yemen and Libya and Mozambique and arrest all those mercenaries? And mercenaries can kill them, can kill your law enforcement dead. So international law, which has always had the problem of law enforcement, is now, that's compounded with mercenaries. So I think that turning to international law as a solution, I think, is not sufficient.
All right, thank you. I don't have any more questions from the audience. If anyone does, please do raise your hand. But if not, I might be able to say that we can conclude this now. Let's give it a moment. Does anyone have anything? It seems not. But so thank you again, Dr. McFate. It was fantastic listening to you speak on this and be able to hear you draw on some of your own personal experience with it, combined with more academic view of it. It was fantastic. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And for those who are interested, you can check out my book, Goliath, or The New Rules of War. They're the same book. And it's more of this, also other issues as well. Thank you very much, Ethan. And it's great questions. I appreciated the conversation.
Thank you very much.